And Mary has said that initially they were just friends, but then they started dating, and apparently Matthew must have liked her because 3 months later he asked her to marry him.
We were knocking on the windows, knocking on the doors. At that point is when I felt that something was wrong, because the key was on the inside of the door, the TV was on, and there was no answer. So Matthew laying there on his back, a foam.
The preacher's wife stands over her husband's body, the stillness of the room, mystery, shattered by the sound of a gunshot. What would drive a woman like Mary Winkler, seen by her community as a devoted mother and quiet wife, to end the life of the man she had shared her home and faith with? Was it a sudden snap, or had something far more sinister been brewing behind closed doors for years? But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. Mary Winkler was living in the small, sleepy town of Selmer, Tennessee, a town where everyone knew each other, where gossip spread quickly, and where appearances meant everything. Mary lived with her husband, Matthew Winkler, and their 3 young daughters in what seemed to be the picture-perfect all-American family. Matthew wasn't just any man. He was the preacher at the 4th Street Church of Christ, a man entrusted with guiding the spiritual lives of the close-knit religious community. In such a role, he was seen as more than a husband and father. He was a man of godly reputation, a symbol of virtue and faith. On the surface, the Winklers embodied an ideal: a devout preacher, a supportive and doting wife, and 3 beautiful children leading a traditional life built on faith and community values. It seemed that Mary and Matthew had the life that others could only dream of. But, as we know, appearances can be deceiving. Behind the doors of their home, the truth was a dark, festering secret, far removed from the image they presented to the world. Mary Winkler, the quiet, unassuming wife, harbored deep personal turmoil, a turmoil so intense it was hard to believe she carried it alone for so long. In reality, her life with Matthew was anything but idyllic. Behind his outward charm and devotion to his congregation, Matthew was a man consumed by control. He wielded power over Mary with devastating cruelty. According to Mary's later testimony, their marriage was riddled with emotional and physical abuse. He belittled her constantly, over the smallest things. Whether it was the way she walked, the way she talked, or even the way she looked at him, nothing was ever good enough. Matthew made sure she knew that. And then there were the horrors no one could see, the abuses hidden behind the facade of their seemingly perfect marriage. Mary would later reveal that Matthew forced her into degrading and humiliating sexual acts, reducing her to an object of his power. He made her wear humiliating outfits that Mary found deeply disturbing, yet she complied, terrified of the consequences if she didn't. Imagine the weight of carrying such a horrifying secret year after year, with no one to confide in. Mary, living in a deeply religious community where divorce was seen as a failure of faith, felt trapped. How could she escape? Where would she go? In this world, women were expected to endure hardship silently, and Mary did just that. But the pain didn't stop at home. Another storm was brewing, a financial disaster that only made things worse. Desperate to improve their dire situation, Mary fell victim to a ruthless lottery scam. Promised large rewards in exchange for upfront fees, she believed it was a way out of their financial struggles. Instead, it was a trap, and she fell hard. The scam bled her dry, leading her to hide a staggering $16,000 in debt from Matthew. But secrets, like lies, have a way of catching up to you. Matthew, with his controlling and domineering personality, grew even more critical of Mary. Her every failure, real or imagined, deepened the chasm between them. Tensions in the Winkler household were rising. The perfect family? That was just an illusion, and as the days passed, it was only a matter of time before the facade shattered, leading to a tragedy that would shock their town and ripple through their community. But could anyone have predicted what was coming? Could anyone have seen behind those closed doors the brewing storm that would soon erupt into violence? March 22, 2006, a day that would forever haunt the sleepy town of Selmer, Tennessee. In the early morning hours, in a home that had witnessed years of silent suffering, tensions between Mary and Matthew Winkler finally erupted in a way no one could have predicted. The home, once filled with the appearance of a peaceful family life, was about to become the scene of a tragic and irreversible act of violence. Mary, who had endured years of emotional and physical abuse, was at her breaking point. The weight of it all, the degrading demands, the financial ruin she had secretly fallen into, and the relentless emotional torment had finally pushed her to the edge. She made a decision that would change everything. In a moment of sheer desperation, Mary grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun. But according to her, she did not take it to kill. She took it to confront Matthew, to make him face what he had done to her, to somehow bring an end to her pain. What happened next remains a matter of chilling debate. Mary stood there, the cold weight of the 12-gauge shotgun in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just another morning. This wasn't just another confrontation. This was the culmination of years of suppressed pain, hidden humiliation, and silent suffering. As she gripped the shotgun, her mind must have been a storm of conflicting emotions. The room was still, dark, and heavy with tension. In that moment, Matthew lay unaware in their bed, completely oblivious to what was about to unfold. Mary approached him, her mind racing through all the memories, the harsh words, the control, the insults, and the nights spent in fear. She later claimed that she only meant to confront him, to make him acknowledge what he had done to her, to make him face the pain he had caused. But the mere presence of the gun in her hand created a situation that would escalate beyond her control. Imagine the room, cold and still in the early hours of the morning, the quiet house, with only the soft sounds of Matthew's breathing breaking the silence. Mary stood by the bed, the barrel of the shotgun pointed at the man who had caused her so much agony, and then, in an instant, the calm was shattered. The trigger was pulled, and the deafening roar of the shotgun tore through the air, piercing the silence. The impact was immediate. The force of the blast threw Matthew from the bed, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Blood spattered across the sheets, the walls, staining everything it touched. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. Matthew lay face down, groaning in pain, the life draining out of him. He was conscious for those first few moments, struggling to understand what had just happened. His breath was labored, his groans growing weaker as blood pooled around him. The man who once held so much power over Mary was now powerless, lying broken on the floor. But for Mary, the next few moments were a blur. Was it shock, guilt, or a numbness after years of emotional torment? She claimed that she didn't remember consciously pulling the trigger. In her mind, it was a blur of emotion, an action that happened without her fully realizing it. Yet, the result was undeniable. Matthew was dying, and the room that once symbolized their life together was now a bloody crime scene. But the horrors of that morning were far from over. The sound of the shotgun blast reverberated through the house, echoing down the hallways, jolting their 3 young daughters awake. In their innocent sleep, they had no idea that their lives had just changed forever. The eldest daughter, Patricia, was the first to react. Hearing the sound and sensing something was terribly wrong, she crept into her parents' room. What she saw must have been a scene of utter confusion and horror. There was her father, face down on the floor, groaning in agony. Blood was everywhere, and there was her mother standing there, pale and shaken, trying to process what had just happened. Mary, in an attempt to shield her daughter from the full horror of the situation, reassured Patricia in a calm, almost robotic voice. "Daddy's hurt," she told her daughter, "but we need to leave." There was no panic in her voice, no hysteria, just a cold, detached focus on what needed to be done next. In the midst of this unimaginable chaos, Mary did not call for help. She didn't attempt to save Matthew, nor did she try to explain to her daughters what had just happened. Instead, she quickly gathered their belongings, packed up her daughters, and left the house. Was she in shock? Was she running from guilt? Or was she simply trying to escape a life she could no longer bear? Whatever her motivation, Mary loaded her daughters into the family minivan and drove away, leaving Matthew behind to die alone. As the family van sped away from the blood-soaked home, Mary had no destination in mind. She drove aimlessly, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The roads seemed endless, the scenery blurring together as she tried to distance herself from the unthinkable act she had just committed. Hours passed, and still she drove. Her mind must have raced with thoughts. What had she done? What would happen next? Was there any way to undo the horror that had unfolded? Eventually, Mary found herself heading toward the Gulf Coast, far from the small Tennessee town where her life had unraveled. But the escape wouldn't last long. Back in Selmer, Matthew's body was soon discovered, and the news spread like wildfire through the small town. A preacher, murdered in cold blood. The very idea shook the community to its core. The police launched an immediate manhunt, desperate to find Mary and her daughters. For 2 days she remained on the run, driving farther and farther from home. But on March 24, 2006, her flight from justice came to an end. Mary was found in Orange Beach, Alabama, sitting quietly with her daughters in the van. There was no grand chase, no dramatic standoff. When the police arrived, Mary surrendered without a fight. She was arrested, and in that moment, the full dark story of what had happened inside that home in Selmer, Tennessee, began to unravel. Mary Winkler's trial began in April 2007, more than a year after that fateful day when she pulled the trigger and ended the life of her husband, Matthew Winkler. The trial quickly became a national sensation, attracting attention far beyond the small town of Selmer, Tennessee. After all, this wasn't just any murder case. This was the shocking tale of a preacher's wife who had gunned down her husband in their own bed. The contrast between the pious, religious family they appeared to be and the violent act Mary committed captivated the public. And as the trial unfolded, the courtroom became the stage for a deeply emotional, contentious battle between two very different versions of what had happened behind closed doors. The trial promised to deliver revelations that no one in the public could have imagined. It was clear from the outset that the case would hinge on two competing narratives, each starkly different from the other. On one side was the prosecution, determined to prove that Mary was a cold, calculating killer, driven by the weight of her financial misdeeds. On the other side stood Mary's defense, portraying her as a woman who had endured years of abuse and trauma, which had ultimately pushed her to the breaking point. It was a fight between a picture-perfect image of a devoted wife turned killer and the reality of a woman living in fear and humiliation who finally snapped. The prosecution's case. The prosecution wasted no time in setting the tone. Their argument was simple yet powerful. They claimed that Mary had killed Matthew to cover up her spiraling financial problems. They dug deep into her secretive involvement in a fraudulent lottery scam, a scheme where Mary had deposited counterfeit checks in hopes of hitting it big. This scam left her with a staggering debt, over $16,000, that she had kept hidden from her husband. For the prosecution, this was the key to unlocking Mary's motive. Could fear of exposure and financial ruin drive someone to murder? they believed it could. According to their argument, Mary had been terrified that Matthew would discover the truth about the money. His strict and authoritative nature, combined with her fear of his reaction, led her to make a deadly decision. The prosecution suggested that Mary had planned the shooting in advance. They argued that when she retrieved the shotgun, she wasn't acting impulsively or in desperation. She was acting with intent. Her goal, they claimed, was to silence Matthew before he could discover her financial secret and confront her. The prosecution hammered home their point by emphasizing Mary's actions in the aftermath of the shooting. Why didn't she call for help? Why did she flee with her daughters, crossing state lines? To the prosecution, these actions were not the signs of a woman in shock or fear. They were the actions of someone fully aware of her guilt, someone who knew exactly what she had done. Her flight was proof of her consciousness of guilt. They pushed hard for a conviction of first-degree murder, hoping to convince the jury that Mary had acted with premeditation and malice. The defense's case. But the defense had a completely different story to tell, a story rooted in years of pain, fear, and abuse. Mary's lawyers set out to dismantle the prosecution's narrative by revealing the dark, hidden truth about her marriage to Matthew Winkler. From the outside, Matthew may have appeared to be a godly man, a beloved preacher in their close-knit community, but according to the defense, behind closed doors, he was a domineering and abusive husband who had inflicted years of emotional and physical torment on Mary. When Mary took the stand in her own defense, the courtroom was transfixed. Her testimony was raw, emotional, and at times almost too painful to hear. She described how Matthew had constantly belittled and berated her, criticizing everything from the way she walked and talked to how she carried out the most basic tasks, like cooking or cleaning. He had stripped away her confidence, leaving her feeling worthless and terrified. But the emotional abuse was only part of the story. The defense revealed something far more sinister. Mary's life behind closed doors was filled with degrading sexual humiliation. She testified that Matthew had forced her to engage in disturbing sexual acts, including making her wear a wig and high-heeled shoes during their encounters, acts that left her feeling violated and degraded. These humiliations were not just physical. They were psychological weapons that Matthew wielded to control and dominate her. The courtroom gasped when Mary presented the very wig and shoes that Matthew had allegedly forced her to wear. These weren't just objects. They were symbols of the abuse she had endured, and their presence in the courtroom made her testimony all the more real, all the more horrifying. As the defense painted this picture of a woman trapped in an abusive relationship, it became clear that Mary's actions were not those of a cold-blooded killer, but of a broken woman who had reached her limit. According to the defense, the events of that night were not planned. They were the culmination of years of fear and desperation. Mary testified that she had retrieved the shotgun not to kill Matthew, but to confront him, to finally force him to face the pain he had caused her. She wanted him to stop, but in that moment of confrontation, things spiraled out of control. Did she pull the trigger, or did the gun go off accidentally in the heat of the moment? Mary claimed she never consciously pulled the trigger, that it had gone off without her intending it to. The defense did not deny that Mary had killed her husband, but they argued that she had been pushed to the edge by years of abuse, both emotional and physical. They portrayed her as a woman who had been living in constant fear, whose mental and emotional stability had been eroded by years of torment. On that night, they claimed, Mary snapped, not in cold blood, but in desperation, driven by years of unbearable pain. After hearing the emotionally charged testimony from Mary Winkler, along with the evidence presented by both sides, the jury was left with an almost impossible task. They had to weigh two drastically different stories. Was Mary a battered wife who had endured years of abuse before finally snapping, or was she a calculated killer who coldly murdered her husband to avoid the consequences of her secret financial misdeeds. The weight of this decision must have been palpable in the courtroom. The air was thick with tension as the jury retired to deliberate. What would they decide? Would they side with the prosecution, who painted Mary as a cold, calculating murderer, or would they see her as a victim, a woman who had been pushed beyond her limits by years of torment and humiliation? On April 19, 2007, after 8 long hours of deliberation, the jury finally returned with their verdict. The room fell silent as the judge read out the decision: guilty of voluntary manslaughter, a lesser charge than the first-degree murder conviction the prosecution had been pushing for. This decision was likely shaped by the jury's sympathy for Mary. Her emotional testimony about the abuse she had suffered, combined with the raw vulnerability she displayed on the stand, seemed to resonate with them. The verdict reflected their belief that while Mary had indeed committed the killing, she had done so in the heat of the moment, driven by extreme emotional disturbance rather than with premeditated intent. The prosecution had fought fiercely for a conviction of first-degree murder, a charge that would have implied that Mary planned and carried out the killing with cold intent. But the jury wasn't convinced. They believed that Mary's actions, while tragic, were not those of a woman who had planned to kill her husband. Instead, they viewed it as an act committed under intense emotional provocation, a breaking point after years of suffering and silence. Following the guilty verdict, the next phase of Mary Winkler's journey was her sentencing hearing, held on June 8, 2007. This hearing would spark an intense wave of controversy. The judge sentenced Mary to 210 days in prison for the voluntary manslaughter conviction. However, given that she had already served 143 days in jail while awaiting trial, and with the judge allowing the remaining 60 days to be served in a mental health facility, this effectively meant that Mary would only spend 1 more week in prison before being released. She was also placed on probation for the remainder of her sentence. To many, this sentence felt shockingly lenient. The reaction was swift and emotional, especially from Matthew Winkler's family. How could the woman who killed their son, who robbed them of a husband and father, walk away after spending only a week in prison? The pain and disbelief were evident during the sentencing hearing. Matthew's mother, Diane Winkler, took the stand to express her outrage, addressing Mary directly in a tear-filled statement that shook the courtroom. "The monster you have painted for the world to see, I don't think that monster existed," Diane said, her voice trembling with anger and grief. In her eyes, Mary had spun a story of abuse to justify her actions, a story that Diane and her family did not believe. To them, Mary's claims of abuse were nothing more than a way to escape the full weight of her actions. Was the court too sympathetic to Mary? Had justice truly been served? But despite the family's emotional appeals, the court's decision stood and Mary Winkler was released. Yet Mary's legal battles were far from over. Following her release, she faced another significant challenge: the fight to regain custody of her 3 daughters. Throughout her trial and incarceration, her children, Patricia, Mary Alice, and Brianna, had been living with their paternal grandparents, Dan and Diane Winkler, who had temporary custody. Could the woman who killed their son be trusted to care for their grandchildren? The answer, for Matthew's parents, was a resounding no. The custody dispute was filled with tension, bitterness, and deep emotion. Matthew's parents believed that Mary was unfit to raise the children, given the fact that she had killed their father. They filed a petition to terminate her parental rights and adopt the children themselves, vowing to keep them safe from a woman they believed had destroyed their family. The case became highly publicized, and public opinion was sharply divided. Some supported the grandparents, believing the children would be better off with them, while others sympathized with Mary, especially in light of her claims of abuse. After months of legal battles and public scrutiny, the case was finally resolved in 2008. In a surprising turn of events, Mary successfully regained custody of her daughters. The case was settled out of court, with the grandparents agreeing to give up their bid for adoption. The terms of the agreement were never made public, but one thing was clear: Mary and her daughters were reunited. They began living together in Smithville, Tennessee, where Mary attempted to rebuild her life away from the spotlight. Mary Winkler's life after the trial was marked by an effort to find some semblance of normalcy, but the events of the past had left their scars, both emotional and physical. In 2010, just a few years after regaining custody of her daughters, Mary was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, MS, a degenerative condition that would come to significantly affect her health. Initially, Mary mistook her symptoms for a stroke, as they primarily affected the right side of her body, but the diagnosis of MS added yet another layer of complexity to her life. After years of enduring mental and emotional pain, Mary now faced the challenge of battling a debilitating physical condition. Despite her health struggles, Mary remained determined to raise her daughters and keep her family intact. In an effort to give back to the community and raise awareness for MS, she became actively involved in charity work. She participated in various fundraising efforts for MS research, as well as for cancer research, children's health, and mental health support for Army veterans. Over time, Mary shifted her focus away from the media spotlight, choosing instead to live a quieter, more private life. But even as Mary Winkler faded from the public eye, the controversy surrounding her case never fully disappeared. For many, the lingering questions about the true nature of her relationship with Matthew remain unanswered. And while Mary Winkler may have moved on with her life, but the story of what happened in that small Tennessee town continues to haunt those involved and captivate the public. But what do you think? Was Mary truly a victim of long-standing abuse who reached her breaking point? Or do you believe there's more to the story? Was justice served in this case, or should Mary have faced a harsher sentence for the death of her husband? And when it comes to the custody battle, did the court make the right decision in reuniting Mary with her daughters? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this case, so let us know in the comments below. What's your take on Mary Winkler's story? If you found this video intriguing, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating true crime stories. And don't forget to hit that bell icon so you never miss an upload. Stay tuned for more real-life mysteries, shocking crimes, and courtroom dramas only here on our channel.